Tsar Alexander became Tsar in 1855. He was very prepared for the job he was about to undertake. Probably the Tsar who had most experience in the history of the Romanovs. He'd been part of the government under his father, Nicholas I. He had travelled throughout Russia, the first of the Romanovs to actually travel through to Siberia. He had been a member of the Council of State, and when his father was away, he had actually deputized for the Tsar. He had been involved in the economic development of Russia by being part of the chairman of the committee responsible for building the St. Petersburg-Moscow railway. Held a number of military titles as well as important civil appointments. So when his father died and became Tsar, he was probably one of the most knowledgeable about Russia's problems of any of the Tsars at that point. And there were many problems at this point. It was a society based upon a serf system. It was a vast country where the nobility, a small percentage of the population, largely controlled with the state about 90% of the rest of the country. His father, Nicholas, had done little to reform the situation. He based his rule on autocracy, orthodoxy, and nationality as the guiding principles of his regime. So really meant the unlimited authority of the Tsar, the traditions of the Russian Orthodox Church, and the Russian nationality. Minorities being repressed, censorship enforced, no freedom to travel abroad, and any hint of rebellion crushed. The structure of government not changed really much since the early 1800s. The Council of State had been appointed to advise the Tsar on legal and financial matters. However, overall, the vast empire was poorly administered. There was an ever-widening gap between state income and expenditure. A huge amount was spent on the army and navy, about 45%. Agriculture was stagnating, the transport system was underdeveloped, and they were falling behind in contrast to the rest of the world. This in part was because it was a serf-based economy. Most European countries by this point were now progressing towards full industrialization. Russia was held back by its own social structure. So this feudal social hierarchy which divided the elite from the tax-paying peasants really was no longer providing the revenue. Neither was it providing recruits to compete with the militaries of the other great powers, and this was highlighted during the Crimean War. The Crimean War had started when Russia had endeavoured to expand its influence into the Balkan and Middle East area to take land, particularly away from the Turks. Britain and France had decided to teach Russia a lesson and had landed in the Crimea, and eventually they had sieged Sebastopol, which was eventually taken. Nicholas I would die before that war was over, February 1855, but his son would end it really quite soon after he became Tsar, a matter of months later, not straight away, but a few months later, really at the beginning of 1856. But in that war had shown the limitations and the weaknesses of the Russian army. It was based on serf recruits. These were recruits that had been conscripted into the army. Serfs had to serve 25 years in the army. It was basically a life sentence to many of them. Their families were moved to these military colonies, which is basically a village run by the army. So it was forced conscription. So on the whole, it was a reluctant army, one that was not educated, not fit, and proved unable to take on the armies of Britain and France. Here you can see an outline of the reign of Alexander II from the death of Nicholas I and his accession to the throne through right to 1881 when he was assassinated by Narodnya Volya. As you can see, in the early years he is mainly concentrating on the emancipation of the serfs, but then later comes other reforms such as military. We see censorship reform, education reform, and some censorship reform as well. Mixed in with that, we see several assassination attempts, and in fact, from about after an initial 10-year reform period, we do get a period where he pulls back from that, and we see a period of reaction up until about the last year of his reign, when he did look to bring in more reforms again. As mentioned earlier, the Crimean War was really a watershed moment for Russia, and had a huge impact on the changing minds in relation to the emancipation of the serfs. Alexander II was seriously aware of the weakness of the Russian state. He quickly signalled his intention to bring about this change and set up a committee to do so. The Crimean War had really shown that Russia could not compete with the Western European nations anymore. Not only was its army not in a similar shape to the Western powers, its communication systems, its technology, the economic backing to their army proved insufficient. And really, to change that, they had to radically change their economic and social system, and their economic and social system was based upon serfdom, was based upon the peasants. Basically, the peasants were Russia. So if Alexander II wanted to restore Russian power and prestige, he would have to change that system. This army, made up of serfs, was really ignominiously defeated. So it highlighted the failures in Russian society, and did more than anything to focus attention on serfdom. And as I said before, the Russian peasant really was Russia. The Russian peasant paid most of the taxes, produced the grain, which was Russia's most valuable export, produced the food, which Russians ate, and formed for upwards of 80-90% of the population. But it was clear by this point that serfdom was failing. So the poverty of serfs was getting worse as the years went on. Part of this problem was the rapid increase in the population of Russia, and the serf productivity, the production of food just could not keep up with this. The serfs were could not move to the cities. to work in factories, which held back progress in industrialization. It was felt by some who made the economic argument that free labour would be more efficient than forced labour. Additionally, the nobility were falling into debt, so they were not able to generate the money to invest in industry. In fact, the old-fashioned agricultural prices failed to produce a grain surplus to export. The serf system also discouraged innovation and experimentation in industry and agriculture. This seems partly responsible for the relative stagnation of the Russian economy in comparison to America and the nations of Western Europe. Serfdom was no longer providing stability. In fact, it was more and more unrest. In the years before Alexander II came to power, in about those 10 years, 1845 to 1854, we see 348 revolts. In fact, in 1856, we see a major peasant revolt in the Black Sea. More recently, moral reasons were emerging. These had often been adopted from Western ideas of really human rights, for example. People arguing that the bondage, serfdom, was morally wrong, and a civilized country, or one that aspired to be, should provide its population with humanitarian standards. They not only argue that serfdom degraded the serfs, but it also degraded the slave owners, the nobility. It weakened the moral character of the upper class, making them lazy and unable to innovate and make a contribution to the well-being of the state. However, without Alexander II's support, this would not have happened. In a speech to the nobility in Moscow on 30th of March 1856, he made it clear that the existing system of serf owning cannot remain unchanged. He also made this famous statement: "It is better to abolish serfdom from above than to wait for the time when it begins to abolish itself from below. I ask you, gentlemen, to think of ways of doing this. Pass on my words to the nobles for consideration." He knew by this point that a system change was the only way to be a world leader again. At this point, he also played up the fear of revolution as a way of putting pressure on the nobility as well. Just a quick one on the conditions of the peasantry and what life was like for them. We really see two types of peasants. We have state peasants who could not leave the village, but did have some freedoms. These are mainly inhabitants of the crown estates, or non-Russians such as Tartars and nomads. They couldn't leave the village without permission, but largely did have some freedoms, such as they could make their own money if they wished, as long as they paid taxes. They could own their own land, and to a certain extent they did have some control over their own lives. The other group were the serfs. Their lives were dominated by the Mir and the nobles who had control over them. The Mir was a council, a collective unit that made decisions about land use and distribution. It was mainly comprised of the heads of the main families of the village, and it normally elected one leader, or what they called elder. To some extent, the peasants liked the Mir. It gave them a collective identity, but it also led to some. It also helped bring about or sustain the backwardness. Um, the peasant land was based on a strip system, which peasants were given strips in different places around the village, which was very fair to them. So if all the good land was in one place, everyone got a bit of that to farm, and then they would be given a different strip the next year. Problem with this is there was no real vested interest to improve the land that you were farming in that year as you moved on to a different bit the next year. Their lives were very much controlled. They had to ask the noble for permission to marry. The noble could also call some of them in for domestic service. So why didn't this happen before? Why did emancipation not come sooner? Well, the enormity of the change really answers that question. The fear and the vested interest are key factors. It would involve loss of land and service for the nobility. And there was great uncertainty over what and should replace serfdom. So that led to nothing being done for many, many years. They also looked to Western Europe and wanted to avoid what they saw as the problems of freedom in Western Europe. There was also the fear that if serfdom went, the whole thing could come crashing down, possibly leading to the end of the Tsarist system and the end of all autocracy. The attitude of the peasants also contributed to this. Their horizons were very limited. They knew nothing more than their own village and their own perspectives. And if anything went wrong, they didn't blame the system, they blamed their local officials. So any trouble or revolts was aimed at them. Their pressing concern was not gaining any rights of any sort. They were concepts that were alien to them. Their most pressing concern was food and land, and often starvation, particularly during the winter periods. The Emancipation Edict was published in February 1861. It stated the right of bondage was forever abolished, and in theory they were serfs were to receive roughly the same amount of land they had cultivated before emancipation. The state would pay compensation to the nobility, and this was to be repaid by the peasants in the form of redemption payments. The Mir was established as the official organ of self-government. This was to be a disappointment to the peasants. There was little rejoicing. In the first 4 months after the Emancipation Decree, there were 647 serious incidents of riot. 1861 as a whole, there were 499 cases of riots. They did not grow any fonder of the decree as time passed either. The reasons for this was that they could not understand why they were being asked to pay for land. They actually felt they'd been tricked by their landowners, and didn't think the Tsar had actually meant for them to pay this. Often the redemption payments they had to pay were above the real value of the land that they were given, and many would stay with this burden for the rest of their lives. The peasants were now bound to the Mir, which would be subject to different laws than the rest of the country, or the rest of the areas. Although this gave them some security, it would perpetuate old ideas and methods and attitudes. The peasants lost land and privileges. The landlords were able to keep the best of the land for themselves, and overall the holdings of ex-serfs fell by 25%. They lost their customary rights to woodland and common pasture, and all this would be made much worse by the rapid growth in population, which doubled between 1800 and 1860, and then redoubled again over the next 40 years. The end of it all, by 1900, agricultural productivity still lagged far behind the rest of the world. The nobility fared little better. In fact, the emancipation hastened the demise of the nobility in the state. Most of them were unprepared for the competitive society that was thrust upon them without the serfs to rely on. Part of the reason for the generous compensation terms they received was that the government wished to ensure their survival. They wanted them to be a moderating force in Russian society. But this didn't happen. They accrued huge debts. By 1905, they had sold a third of the land they retained in 1861. Half of the money received in the first 10 years after 1861 went to pay off existing debts. In fact, their ability to act as stabilizing force actually declined after this. So there were the political hopes for emancipation. The economic hopes for it also did not come to pass. Agriculture did not provide surplus capital for industrialization. A lot of money was taken from the agricultural sector, but little was actually put back in. It was hoped that a revitalized peasant economy would provide the basis for industrialization by providing surplus capital for investment. But this didn't happen. Agriculture was bled dry, was really counterproductive in the end. There was not enough capital generated to actually finance industrialization on any great scale. In agriculture, there was no encouragement for new methods either to become more efficient. And mostly due to this, we did not see significantly higher productivity. And in comparative terms, Russia was falling further and further behind her competitors. The Emancipation Edict or Decree was clearly a momentous event in Russian history and is of great importance. However, some have been critical. Richard Pipes characterizes emancipation as being too cautious, too little, and too late. You can have some sympathy with this argument, but you have to take into some consideration the context in which Alexander found himself in, and Pipes is probably unfair to him. It's certainly true that previous Tsars could have done more, but Alexander couldn't really have acted with greater speed because of the need to maintain the support of the nobility. There's no doubt the redemption payments were too heavy, but again, Alexander could not have destroyed the nobility. They were needed as a stabilizing force in this new Russia. The Mir proved to be a block to progress and the lack of full civil rights to the peasants. But the Mir was trusted, and again, I think anything else probably would have been too radical for them to be comfortable with. It allowed the peasants to run their own affairs. The Tsar, he could not be expected to shake off his firm beliefs in what Tsardom stood for. He believed in autocracy, that power had been given to him from God himself. he was not interested in any liberal reforms, no major liberal reforms anyway. Any more radical reform probably would have led to perhaps chaos and maybe anarchy in Russia. The emancipation, although it still left Russia far behind, it was still a dramatic change, and Tsar Alexander should be given credit for that. It was a surprising degree of reform and change in this whole period, which we'll talk about in the next presentation.